Hi, I'm David Maneri. Thanks for joining us for another edition of It Happened in Cambridge. I'm at Mount View Cemetery in Cambridge, Galt, and this is where Margaret Hamilton McCabe is buried. Margaret Hamilton, her maiden name, grew up in Galt, started working with the Galt Reporter, and rose to the highest ranks of the Canadian business establishment, becoming the first female president of Thomson Newspapers. This is her story. When I think of Margaret Hamilton, I can't help but think of her husband, St. Clair McCabe. I met the two only once, and it was for lunch. We had a great chat that day. I took a few pictures. The story of Margaret Hamilton McCabe is a story interwoven with the Galt and then later Cambridge Reporter. When I met Margaret and St. Clair McCabe for lunch, it was in 2003, I think, but it was after the Reporter had closed. The Reporter was owned at that time by Torstar, and they decided they had also owned the local papers, the Kitchener Record and the Cambridge Times, and of the three, they decided to close the oldest newspaper in Canada, the Cambridge Reporter, 157 years. It closed, it was September 19th, I think, 2003, and it was a Friday. And the editor, Kevin Swayze, had asked me to write a kind of an obituary for the Reporter. He'd called me up and said, "Listen, Dave, the bad news." I was a history columnist for the paper at the time. I had been a sports reporter years earlier. He said, "Could you write a piece about the history of the Reporter?" And I said, "Oh, that was bad news about the Reporter. Very sad to hear that. How long did I have to write this piece?" And he said, 2 days. The paper was closing on Friday, so there was very little warning for the staff and for residents. It was a cultural institution, that paper, so it was more than just a sort of a local paper record that was closing. It was something that was ingrained within the very fabric of the people of Cambridge. Margaret Hamilton and St. Clair McCabe and their son, who had gone to school, I think law school with Terry Williston. They were there for lunch that day. It was just a tremendous time to chat with them. And Margaret and St. Clair told me about their early days at the Reporter, how they had gone with Kenneth Thomson back to Toronto. When Roy Thomson was building his newspaper, what became a tremendous international newspaper empire, he started out modestly enough in North Bay. He bought the paper there. He then bought the Woodstock paper, and the Galt Reporter was the third paper in his what later became an empire, and it really was an empire. Thomson became Lord Thomson of Fleet a little later on. He was notorious as being a spendthrift. And maybe that's one of the reasons for his success. But he sent Kenneth Thomson to the Galt Reporter to learn the newspaper business. So young Kenneth Thomson came here. He lived for a time at a room and board at the YMCA in Queen Square. He also lived up on an apartment just near Oak Street and Spruce on Main Street. When you go up the Main Street Hill past Central School, there's an apartment building on the left-hand side, still there. And he had a room in there. And Sil Eccles, who lived just down the street, a school teacher at GCI, would famously talk about Kenneth Thomson, the man destined to become the richest man in Canada, and I think at one time he was about the 11th richest person in the entire world. And young Ken Thomson would go across to the little corner store and buy one egg for breakfast. Not a dozen, like most people would, but one egg when he needed it for breakfast. He was here for a few years, learning the ropes, becoming ingrained in the community, curling and getting to know people. And two of the people he got to know best were Margaret Hamilton and St. Clair McCabe. Margaret Hamilton grew up on Blair Road, not far from the corner of Blair and Blenheim. There's an old stone house there. And that house, it looks like it might be the first house on that side of town. It wasn't, as she told me that day. That was the second house. The first house was actually across the street and just down the road a little bit. It's a white house today. That was the oldest house on the west side of the hill there of Galt. The Hamilton house was the second house, that stone house. And although I don't know for a fact, I think she would have gone to Dixon Public School, which wasn't far away, and then Galt Collegiate. And but what a remarkable businesswoman she became. After going to Toronto, she rose through the ranks of the Thomson organization and helped the Thomson organization grow in stature internationally, as did St. Clair McCabe. I mean, they were two of the key people throughout their careers that helped Thomson Newspapers and Thomson International grow so profoundly, which helped make Kenneth Thomson one of the richest men in the world. And they were his trusted advisors, and they both rose to in fact, when Margaret Hamilton retired, she retired at the very peak. She was the president and the chief operating officer of Thomson Newspapers, which is saying something. It was a male-dominated business world, and certainly the newspaper business was dominated by males. And yet Margaret, through her own intelligence and sheer ability, rose to become president. And she was the first female president of Thomson Newspapers. When we had lunch together, she heard that I was a writer, that I'd written a book, and I was working on another one. And that book later became The River and the Railroad. It's sort of a semi-autobiographical but fictitious account of a couple 13-year-old boys who see a murder, get into a bit of trouble, and want to hop on the train, the Canadian Pacific at Barry's Cut, and head down to Florida. She told me the story of the pants burglar, and I just love the sound of that, the pants burglar. And she said the pants burglar's barn. And those words together, I'd never forgot those. And she said that's a story that I should really hear. When she was young, and I think during the Depression years, there was a local bandit, a local prowler who would break into people's houses and steal the men's pants, because quite often the men would leave their wallets in the back pocket of their pants, and it would be thrown over a chair or something. And so this burglar, unknown, was famous for stealing men's pants. He didn't take jewelry and other things. He just took these men's pants. Eventually, he was found out, and the pants were discovered. And they were discovered at a barn on the river flats toward Blair. That hence became known as the Pants Burglar's Barn, because that's where all these pants and discarded wallets were. And so thanks to Margaret Hamilton, I incorporated that story, the legend of the Pants Burglar and the Pants Burglar's Barn, into The River and the Railroad. And it was great to chat with them and hear about the early days of the Reporter. And they had worked there, it would have been half a century before I was there. So they had such a grasp of the history there, and having worked with Kenneth Thomson so closely over the years. She lived to be 101 years old. She and St. Clair McCabe died. St. Clair McCabe died just a few years prior to her. They were devoted to each other throughout their lives. And St. Clair McCabe, I think he was 97 when he died, but they have a beautiful stone at Mount View Cemetery with the McCabe and the Hamilton name on it. And that's the story of Margaret Hamilton. Thank you for joining us for another edition of It Happened in Cambridge.